Chavre, how are you? I hope everyone is gesund, stark, und freilich, begash mich zu beruchnis. Today is Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Parshas Tetzaveh, and this past week was Tetzaveh, the day the Frierdiker Rebbe arrived in America 86 years ago, and this coming week is Purim, Chag Purim, and Shabbos is Parshas Zocher. So what is the connection between all these inyanim? First, we'll start as usual with tzedakah, gdelet tzedakah, shemakareves esagula. Through tzedakah we bring Mashiach now. Now we're going to start with a pasuk from Tehillim, which is directly related to what we're going to speak about today. And that's a pasuk in Kapitel Kuf Lamed Beis, pasuk Tes. Kayanecho yilbishu tzedek. We say this pasuk before Simchas Torah, before our kofis, during one of the pesukim of the Ato Areso. In any case, we translate Ka'anecha. This is David HaMelech who's praying for the Beis HaMikdash, the building of the Beis HaMikdash, which David HaMelech didn't see in his time, but he longed for it, he yearned for it. So he says, Ka'anecha, he's waiting for the day when he'll see Ka'anecha yilbishu tzedek. Let your priest don righteousness. V'chasidecha yiranenu. Chasidecha goes when your devout ones. Yiranenu, sing joyously. That goes on the Levium. So David HaMelech is praying that the Kohanim should be able to come to the day where we see the Kohanim dressed. Yilbishu tzedek, they're dressed in righteousness. And the Levium are singing. So from here we see that the Big Day Kahuna, the clothes of the Kohanim, were called Yilbishu Tzedek, righteousness. In other words, even though in this week's parsha it says that the clothes were L'chovei L'Sefares, which is for glory and beauty, but what they represent is a level of superior spiritual quality, special people. So the Kohanim represented garments, and these garments, all of the garments, have an inner spiritual significance, and they symbolize something very, very deep and profound in the service of Hashem. In other words, and this is before we start bringing out the point, I just want to start with a klotz kasha, a very obvious question. Last week, we spoke about the pasuk, which says that Hashem said, "V'osu li migdosh v'shachanti b'soichom." Make me a dwelling place, and I will dwell in them. And on this, everyone knows the famous saying, "B'soichoi loy nemar." It doesn't say I will dwell in it, in the building, but b'soichom, in them. B'soich kol echad v'echad miYisrael. So in other words, the pasuk is teaching us that when we say that Hashem says, "Build me a home," the house, it's not, the main point is not so much that he's dwelling in this house, in the building, so to speak, but in the sanctuary, but it represents that it's a witness and a testimony that Hashem is with the Yidden. And on a deeper level, and every single person is a mini sanctuary. I think as we spoke last week. But what's interesting is in this week's Pasha, there's a pasuk in Kapitel Chavtes, pasuk Memei, where it says, "V'shachanti b'soich b'nei Yisrael." So why do we have to always make this shturim when it comes to the pasuk? That was said that it means in them and not in it, in the building. We have another pasuk which is clear and it says that Hashem resides in the Yidden. In this week's parsha. So the answer is simple and obvious, and this tells us the difference between this week's parsha and last week's parsha. Last week's parsha, the discussion is about the utensils, the menorah, the shulchan, the mizbeach, and the krushim, the beams, and the coverings. So it's about the chefza, the objects. So therefore, when the Torah is talking about the objects, we have to be told that it's not about the objects, but it's about the people. And even all those objects, represent also aspects of serving Hashem. But over here, even though we're talking about garments, but really the whole discussion of the garments is that they're a garment on a person. In other words, every single one of these garments represents a different spiritual talent, a different spiritual ability, a different sign of spiritual perfection. So therefore, in this week's Parsha, in other words, the stress is on the Gavra. It's on the person. The person has these garments. And all these garments represent a different level of serving Hashem. In a way, you could say, they have the famous book, it's called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I think this week's Parsha, we could talk about the habits of spiritual people. And since the Pasuk says in Parshas Yisroi, V'atem tili mamleches koyanim v'goy kodosh, the entire Jewish nation is really koyanim, to a certain extent. So that means the significance in our serving Hashem has to be that we understand, that we look at all these garments, and from the garments and understanding what each garment represents, it's another checklist of spiritual development and growth, that we have to focus on this area and this area and another area. But in today's shiur, we're not going to speak about the particular garments and what each one represents. Instead, we'll start talking about another garment. And from that garment, I'm not sure if I ever spoke about this Rashi or not. To me, this is one of the most unbelievable revelations of godliness in Rashi. Achsidische Rashi. And I'm taking part of what I'm going to speak today from Lakutei Sichos Chelik Chof Vov. Tetzaveh, where it's a Rashi Sicha about the ephod, and it's on the Rashi that I'm going to mention, and it's Tetzaveh Aleph, and the Rebbe discusses a machlekes, the Rambam and Rashi, what is the definition, the geder of the Big Day Kahuna? Is it more a levush or more a tachshit? Which we're not going to get into now. But first, let's talk about the Rashi. And from this, I'm going to take a general lesson, not about the ephod, but about, we might be able to call it, the first habit, but a primary habit of a spiritual person is what's going on in his head space, in his brain space, in his perspective. It's all in the mind. What does Rashi say about the ephod? Something phenomenal, which you don't find anywhere else such a thing. Rashi says, what was the ephod? The ephod was a robe-like garment. That was one of the big kahuna. And the Kohen Gadol wore it. And it says, Ve'ephod loy shamaiti ve'loy matzosi b'vraisa pirish tavnisoi. Rashi says that I have not heard, nor have I found in a braisa an explanation of his design. But my heart tells me that it's belted around his back. The part of the apron usually covers, that was hanging on his back. It lies on him from behind. And then he says, like an apron. And then he says, with which noble women gird themselves when they ride the horses. That's what Rashi says. So over here, there's many questions. What does it mean, V'libi Oimeli? V'libi Oimeli? What does that mean? How do we understand that? V'libi Oimeli. I had a dream. What does it mean, V'libi Oimeli? Based on what? Usually, if you have a pirush, it's not based just on V'libi Oimeli. There's got to be something more to it. My heart tells me. If somebody gave an explanation of something and someone said, what's the evidence? Based on what? What do you mean? What do you think? Anyways, so here I'm going to read to you what the Rebbe brings down in Likutei Sichos Chelik Chavav, as I mentioned before, page 198. And he says as follows: Es is Yudua, der Sipur was Malamdim der Zählen Kinder. It's known, the story, that teachers, Malamdim usually goes on teachers in Cheder, like primary school, elementary. And there's no number on Yudua. Very interesting. Like, it's so universal. We don't even have to quote a source. It's known, the story, the Malamdim, the Zählen Kinder, that tell children in Cheder, learning it in Pirush Rashi, learning this Rashi about the ephod. And he says that it's like these noble women riding, when they're riding horses. And the Rebbe says, even though most students never saw such a thing, but what's the explanation? As a mol at Rashi, geindik and gas, Rashi was strolling, walking in the street, gesehen via Sora, a noble woman. Izrecheves alasus was riding a horse. Ongeton and a sinner, and she was wearing this sort of apron-like garment which was covering from the back. Und Rashi hat sich sehr mit Steyr gewesen. Rashi was pained by this, troubled by this. It was something that's seemingly not modest. And it's known that a woman riding a horse is not considered modest, as we know from other places in Chumash. Dennoch, afterwards, schreiben die Pirush al Torah b'Maisa Ephod, afterwards when Rashi was writing his Pirush on Chumash concerning the ephod, Nisyash v'daitoi, he consoled himself, he became calm. Defun gelernt ha'ira b'avidosei l'koinoi. He learned a lesson in his serving Hashem, abir b'Maisa Ephod, an explanation, and what were the dimensions, what the ephod looked like. Is das Eichas Bora for was man hat ihm das bewiesen? Now he understood why the Eibishter made it, that he should encounter such a vision. But they to verstehen besser, Maisa Ephod, so he should understand better what the ephod looked like. Von dem hat Lies genommen, said, okay, anyways. And then the Rebbe learns the Hira from this. And he says, what does Libi Emily? Libi Emily means Yichidush HaBenefesh, the essence of his soul. Rashi was on a high level. And when he looked at something from the world, even though initially he was bothered by it, but then he saw through it. His soul, his neshama, his Yichidush HaBenefesh, picked up what the real message was. And the Rebbe, when he said the Sikha, by the way, first he said Rashi is Nitztayer, which means if something happens, first you feel guilty about it. It bothers you. Not that you're going to go look for something which is not allowed, Chas v'Sholem, prohibited, and then say, I'm different. I could hear Goyish music, or I could see images, the opposite of protecting my eyes, because I could see how to learn a lesson from it in Avodas Hashem, like Rashi did. God forbid someone should walk away from this year thinking like that. What are we speaking about? We're talking about putting on a new pair of glasses, seeing the world through the lens of the Torah. So if we're talking about the habits of spiritually highly effective people, a high spiritual level of holiness like Kohanim, it means the first thing is, before we talk about the details of which garments, begin having a Torah hashkafa. You want to be a spiritual person and you want to navigate the world, you have to koch sich in hashgacha pratis. And I believe this is one of the main job description of the Rebbe, that he wanted to inculcate us all the time, every single Shabbos throughout the years, and every single Farbrengen, maybe you could say that one of the Rebbe's job description was to try to make us live a life where lekus b'pshitos v'oilam is b'schachos. When we walk down the street, And we saw all the dots are connected. And it's all really the Eibishter. Similar to the story with Rebbe Yamin Kletzker. The Rebbe loved this story, that when he was in business and he made a cheshbon of when he was making a summation of his figures, and he made the line across it, Sachakel, ain't it no valley? That was his natural mindset, that he sees spirituality in everything. And there's so many stories about Chassidim where the same point is brought home. They lived a different life. It's not a life where sometimes they turn on the spirituality quotient and it becomes the majority, and sometimes not. No! They're living their life. They're living a life. They're in a different place. They're in a different space. They're in a different planet. They share the same space. They're here, but they're not here in a positive way. They see everything spiritual. The world is not a cover-up. And as we see from this Rashi, wow, I can't get over it. Rashi takes an immodest tzir that he encountered a French noblewoman riding a horse, and what does he see? He doesn't see a French woman riding a horse. He sees one of the begodim of the Kohen Gadol in Kochi Kochim, in Yom Kippurim. He sees the highest of the highest of the highest of the highest levels of spirituality. So not only it's not an Indian of Shalosh Klipsat Meis, it's transformed and it's Kiddusha Mamish of the highest order, of the highest rank, of the highest grade. And this is a lesson that we have to take about life in general. Everything, like the Baal Shem Tov said, Yedr Zach was a Yid Herta Dezet is a Yirah and Avedis Hashem. Just to give you another example, there's many stories I could mention that we mentioned before, but I don't know if I ever mentioned this story. There was a famous Fabring, and I think it was Zayin Cheshrin Memvov. Don't quote me on this. But anyways, there was a story where the Rebbe spoke publicly that he got a letter from a woman. Some lady wrote the Rebbe a letter and said that she had received a letter, a chain letter that said, you better continue to send on this letter to other people or else you'll be cursed and who knows what. Now, this is these sort of black magic, the black arts, I don't know what you call it, kishuf, curses. This will happen to you, that will happen to you. So this lady wrote to the Rebbe that she received such a letter and she's scared. So the Rebbe told her, nothing has a power over you, there's nothing that could cause you any damage. It's only the Eibishter. The Eibishter is the only one that has the power. But what the Rebbe did after that was so amazing. The Rebbe said that he wondered why was he exposed to find out about such a thing. And the conclusion is that we have to make a chain letter in Kedusha. And the Rebbe, out of this story that a lady wrote to him, that she'd received such a letter with a threat and curses, the Rebbe transformed it completely around and said, and he gave the instruction after this Fabrengen, that every single person should send a chain letter, 10 letters to 10 people with the sources in Torah that say that you have to ask for Mashiach. Hashem wants us to ask for Mashiach. And when you send that chain letter to 10 people and you include the quotes of the Holy Svarim that say that we have to ask for Mashiach, ask those 10, each one of those 10, to pass it on to another 10. So here the Rebbe took something which is the lowest of the low, and he transformed it into the highest of the high, and he saw it a lekuz b'pshitas. What does a lekuz b'pshitas mean? Godliness is the de facto position, the default position, Olam is bischachos. The fact that there's a world, that's like unnatural. That's what it means when we say elikuz, pshitos. You see straight away the godly dimension, the divinity in something. That means elikuz, pshitos. That goes without saying. Olam is bischachos. The fact that we're living in a physical world, that's like unnatural, even though it's happening. But that's secondary. That's not primary. So here the Rebbe took a story of a mishigas. You know what means a mishigas? A craziness. Some mishigas, some foolishness, some craziness, and the Rebbe transformed it around into something of holiness of the highest level. We're going to make an unbelievable campaign that's now going to influence hundreds of thousands of people about the importance of asking for Mashiach. And where did it start from? From some shugana that's connected to Klippa that put a curse on someone. And the Rebbe learned from this how we have to use chain letters for Kedusha. So that's another example. Similar to the story of Rashi, that he saw a woman riding on a horse, which seems to be something negative connected to Klippa, and from that he understood what the Kohen Gadol is wearing. It's Big Kahuna. It's the highest level of Kedusha and holiness. And this is the connection, first of all, to Tetzaveh, the day the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America. We all know that before World War II, most of the Chassidim lived in villages and towns, not in cosmopolitan cities. Of course, there were always some Chassidim that lived in Leningrad, some lived in Moscow. But generally speaking, there was Nevel, there was Kremenchuk, there was Klimovich, the list goes on, of smaller cities, smaller towns. The headquarters were in Lubavitch and in Rostov. The Frierdiker Rebbe moved to Leningrad, fine. But generally speaking, like my mother, Oleh Shalom, she came from Minkach. Before she went to the concentration camp Auschwitz, Achman al-Zan, she would describe how she had gardens with fruits and vegetables and goats and things like that. So the Jewish life in general was more secluded from the cosmopolitan cities of secularism and modernism, etc., etc. Where did it really start, the idea of a Jew living in a city with all the problems that are in a city, etc., etc., after World War II? So this lesson that we take, that we're in the belly of the beast, so to speak, in Olam Hazeh, Tachton, Shein Tachton, Matamen, really, really surrounded by Gashmias and things that could be a major cover-up. Similar to the idea of the French women riding on the horses, which today a person could be exposed to things similar to that much more often than before World War II. And this is the idea of representative of the Frierdiker Rebbe coming to America after World War II and Tetzaveh. So now the message of having your brain space filled with Torah, Psukim of Torah, Mishnayos Bal Peh, Tanya Bal Peh, in general the right pair of glasses, a Hasidic mindset. Now that lesson and the importance of that lesson is greater than ever before. That's number one. That's the connection with Tetzaveh. The connection to Parshas Tetzaveh, Parshas Zocher, is an amazing connection. Listen to this. In the Sicha Vayikra, Tov Shin Mem Tes, page 328, the Rebbe says as following. We know that Amalek was Asher Korcha Baderech. The literal translation is, he encountered you, he attacked you on the way. And Korcha, usually Chassidus explains, he brings you a coldness, an indifference, an apathy. And he says, don't get excited about holiness. Calm down. Doubts, all that. But here the Rebbe adds something else, that the word Korcha, Miloshen Mikra. Mikra, Nikra means things just happen by itself. It's not divinely ordained. It's not connected to Hashem. Chas v'sholem. And the Rebbe connects Asher Korcha Baderech to Mikra. And listen to Mamish, the words that he says, Shaloi Yirin Yoneh Ashgache Pratis Chuli. Part of Amalek's job is to conceal, cover up, deny divine providence. In particular, Amalek is there for you to try that you should deny Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence. So this is exactly what we're talking about. The opposite of that is the story of Rashi and the story of the Rebbe. The opposite of that means that whatever happens to you, number one, there's a message. There's a message to you. It has relevance to you. And it has relevance to you in particular. And it was divinely ordained by Ashgacha Pratis Mamish that you should get this message. And it connected to Achdus Hashem. And Amalek is over there trying to tell you, no, Lav Dafke, I don't see the connection. You know, it's very easy to look at the world and say nature rules, God forbid, etc. You could deny. And this is the connection to Purim. Purim again is the antidote, the opposite. What's the uniqueness of the miracle of Purim? The uniqueness of the miracle of Purim is that it was a miracle enclosed in nature. There was nothing supernatural. That's one of the reasons why we wear a mask. That's one of the connections to the name Esther. Esther means concealment. It comes from the word Vanoichi Hastar Aster. But nevertheless, what happened by Purim? It's a miracle. And that's why we say Sha'osa Nisim Lavisenu. By Yom Meim Bizman Hazeh, we make that bracha. Because there we say it was an obvious miracle. Why? Because all the details followed one after the other. So many coincidences, which we realize and we believe. We don't believe in coincidences. So over there, the Chiddush is that even though it was completely natural, but still, what came out in an obvious manner, in a demonstrative manner, was that it was a divine revelation. It was a nes. It was a miracle that was enclosed in nature. And over there, the accomplishment is that nature becomes uplifted. Imagine nature sheds its concealment, its cover-up. And nature, in nature, pierced through the divine hand. And that's the Chiddush. Because usually we say the word Teva is Miloshen Tuba B'Yamsov. Tuba means that it's sunk in, it's drowned. The hand of God is not obvious. By a miracle, the hand of Hashem is obvious, but by Teva, Miloshen Tuba B'Yamsov, the hand of Hashem is not obvious. So this is the Chiddush of the Nes of Purim, that even though it was Teva, which usually means a concealment, where the hand of Hashem is not obvious, over here it's Al Derech Nes, Milosh Rama, it's like the entire natural order became uplifted, that the divinity, the miraculous, the fact that it's Yad Hashem became revealed. And this is the lesson that we have to take from Purim, which is the opposite of Amalek, Nikra, that says, no, it's not connected to Hashem. It just happened to be like this, denying Hashem's existence. And now we understand the connection of all these things. Tetzaveh coming to America, where we first have to work on this talent, this trait of being able to not fall for the facade and to see through the veil of nature, of the world. Starting from Tetzaveh, the idea of coming to America. And then we have the idea of the ephod, what Rashi taught us. We learned what the ephod was because of an encounter of what happened in the streets of wherever he lived. And this is the first message which I'm taking from that in general, to be a proper Mamleches Kohanim. First thing we have to start working on is our mind. If our mind will be in the right place, the rest will follow. Everything hebt sich on from Moyach. But that comes through learning, that comes through training. You know, people don't naturally have a Torah Shkofa. You could say because by many people it's the opposite of a Lekuz B'Pshitas, Olam is B'Schachos. It's actually Olam is B'Pshitas and a Lekuz B'Schachos. They see the natural dimension, which is seemingly more obvious. To be able to go against the current and to peel away the layer, and that the divinity, the godliness, should pierce, that's because you have to work on yourself to get the 20/20 vision, the real vision. And that's only somebody who's steeped into Torah, immersed in Torah, and works on himself to develop that sort of eyesight, which comes through many years of exercise and work constantly. And that's the lesson of Purim. We have to look at the nature differently. Just like in the story of Purim, we saw in an obvious manner how it was Yad Hashem. So the Rebbe should help that we should work on ourselves in this area, which, my friends, your whole life will be different every single day. I promise you. You don't understand how liberating it will be, how uplifting it is. When you live your life in such a way, there's a centrality, everything's connected, you're in a relationship with Hashem, no matter what's going on. So if we work in this way, we'll bring about the Geula, which then will be ayin ba'ayin yiro. We'll see eye to eye with Hashem, just like now, obviously, the true vision is that spirituality is primary and eternal, and what really counts. So too, we will see it as the Eibishter sees it, and that will be the ultimate when Mashiach comes, that of course will be totally immersed in a physical world, but at the same time, we'll see how the total absolute spirituality is in the physical itself, and the physical itself does not cause a barrier whatsoever. Posting from my home, Be'ez Hashem Yisbarach, your man in Melbourne.